morning, everyone. Our reading this morning is from James 5:13 to 16, the prayer of faith. Thank you. Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective.
Thanks, Kessel. Great, thanks everyone. So there was once a man who robbed a bank. His name was Jack. He had planned this bank for years. Scoped it all. Transfer the money out of the country. He knew everything. And so Jack turns up to rob the bank. And everything goes perfectly to plan. He gets in, he gets the money, he gets out, he transfers the money to the Cayman Islands, he buys the beach house in the Caribbean that he had always wanted, and he moved there, the perfect crime. But here was the problem. Jack couldn't sleep. Every night he would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the money that he had stolen, and it was getting him down. It had ruined his perfect plan, his perfect crime. And after weeks and weeks of this, completely shattered, one night he got out of bed and he kneeled down by the side of the bed and he put his hands together and he closed his eyes and he said, God, if you're there, please can you tell me what I should do? What shall I do with this money that I've stolen? And immediately a booming voice came down from heaven. Give it back and hand yourself in to the police. Jack sat there for a second. And then eventually he said, anyone else up there? As Rebecca said, it's Pentecost Sunday today, so I am talking in the next of our Let Us Pray series, talking about bold and impossible prayers. Do we still believe in a God who answers impossible prayers? Do we believe in a God who does miracles? And I will warn you from the beginning here, I am going to be talking about some big and some potentially difficult topics here. So if any of this stuff kind of hits you a bit harder than it would do, I would really encourage you to go and grab anyone that's here with an orange lanyard to chat to afterwards or to pray with. This time last week I was not here because I was at the Baptist Assembly in Harrogate, the Baptist Union's kind of annual I know, lucky me, all the places I get to go. And while we were there was, a number of kind of church services, and one of the songs that we sang as one of those services over the weekend was the song that Flicks just sang to us now, You Never Let Go, an old Matt Redman song. And it is one of those songs that always sticks with me. I, as lots of you know, play guitar, and I've been leading the music in churches up and down this country and loads of other places for about 30 years now, and I have sung thousands upon thousands of songs, but this one always sticks with me, and it's because many, many, many years ago now, Louise and I had some friends who had been trying for a baby for years and years and had failed to conceive. And they went through IVF and all of this kind of stuff. And eventually, after years and years and years, our friends got pregnant, but really tragically, soon after, had a miscarriage. And a couple of months after this happened, we were all going to this big Christian conference together. And as you can imagine, our friends found it incredibly difficult because people would stand on stage saying things like, all you've got to do is pray. We believe in a God who answers prayers. And we would sing all these upbeat, kind of triumphal music. And they were really struggling. And we were kind of walking through them with that. And for days and days on end at this conference, we would pray with them, we would sit with them, we would cry with them. And I got to the last day of this conference, and I've got to be honest, I was angry. Because I felt like I had no more words left to say to them. And that all of the words, all of the prayers, all of the everything was powerless. And I felt like it was pointless. And we got to the last night, and we sang this song. And there's this mid-8 towards the end of the song, and it says these words, I can see a light that is coming for the heart that holds on. And there will be an end to these troubles, but until that day comes, still I will praise you. And I sang those words in anger almost, like almost shouting them as a prayer for my friends, that there would be a day, that the light would be coming for them, and that there would be an end to their troubles. And a couple of months later, we got a phone call from them to say that she was pregnant again. And this time, there were no complications. And they finally had a baby who is now our godson. It was an answer to a bold and impossible prayer, right? But here's the thing. It would be really easy for me, standing up here preaching this morning, to use that as an example of a God who answers big, bold, impossible prayers. That all we've got to do is pray and God will answer those kinds of prayers, right? But I think we have to be honest here. Because my experience, and I'm sure your experience as well, is that very rarely in my life do those big, massive prayers get answered. We know it doesn't work like that. There's a phenomenon which statisticians call survivorship bias. And it was started in World War II when they were doing some tests on World War II fighter planes. What would happen is planes that had been shot at, when they made it back into base, people would look at where they'd been shot and they would try and reinforce those areas that had kind of taken most artillery fire. And they did this for ages, and it wasn't really seeming to make much difference until there was a statistician called Abraham Wald who said, hang on, this is all a bit pointless. Surely what we need to do is track down the planes that didn't make it back. And then we'll really see what the weakness actually is. Survivorship bias says we only see the successful stories. We see it in the news all the time, like in this story of Agnes Fenton, who lived to 110 years old, and on her 110th birthday, she was interviewed in the paper, and she said the secret to her long life is 3 beers and a whiskey every day. For the last 70 years, every single day, apparently, Agnes has drunk 3 beers and a whiskey before bed. And we look at that and people will go, well, maybe that's the secret to a long life, right? Without obviously looking at all the people who might have been drinking 3 beers and a whiskey and not quite making it to 110, because survivorship bias. A bit more seriously, I've talked about this book once before here in church. It's called A Pastoral Theology of Childlessness by someone called Emma Nash. And in it she talks about the story of Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. Sarah was 90 years old and there was a miracle birth. She gave birth to Isaac. And in the book, Emma Nash writes this: in addition to Abraham and Sarah, Elkanah and Hannah, and Jacob and Rachel, we find Isaac and Rebekah, who initially had some trouble conceiving Jacob and Esau. We see Manoah and his wife, the parents of Samson, and Elizabeth and Zechariah. There is something alienating, she says, about these stories because they always end with a miracle child. She was talking from a position of someone who had tried for a child and it hadn't happened. And she said she didn't find solace in the Bible because what she found was always the miracle solution. There must have been stories that didn't end with miraculous birth, but survivorship bias, right? We don't read those stories in the Bible. And so when we do see the stories of Abraham and Sarah, Elkanah and Hannah, Jacob and Rachel, and all the rest, we can hear those stories and we can think that's all there is. And this means it hurts even more when your experience is not this one. In the book, Emma talks about the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel, which ends with the miraculous birth of Samuel. And she quotes a man who had tried for years with his wife to have kids and wasn't able to. And he says this: Hannah pleads tearfully for children. How I wish sometimes that her prayers had not been answered. They would then resonate with my own. That is a tough line to read, isn't it? It's powerful, but is a difficult line to read. If you're in this position, or if you have been, or if you're supporting anyone in a similar position, I really would encourage you to grab someone, chat to someone afterwards, because these things are not easily dealt with on our own. But we have to be honest here, right? Because I think most of us would agree, if we were being truthful, that this quote better sums up our prayers than some others. How many miracles have you prayed for? How many times have you prayed that God would intervene in a major way in something, but it hasn't happened? Because I think lots of us were probably told at various points that prayers do get answered, right? Maybe people quoted verses like the ones that Kesua read to us from James 5. Is anyone among you ill? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. That's what we were told, right? But what about those prayers that don't get answered? I'm sure I'm not the only person probably who wondered that their prayers might not have been answered because they weren't righteous enough, like these lines say, or because they didn't pray hard enough. Anybody remember these wristbands? They were like WWJD band's less successful cousin. This is PUSH. It means pray until something happens. And that's what we were taught to do. And I wonder really if I was taught that, at least in part, because it's one way to avoid answering the difficult question about what happens when God doesn't answer my prayer. We just carry on praying until something happens. Because we have to be honest, we've all prayed big prayers that haven't been answered, haven't we? Every one of us. And that can lead us to ask big questions about God. Why isn't God answering my prayer? And then the logical next step is to say that if God isn't answering my prayer for my family to get pregnant, for my auntie to be cured of cancer, whatever it is, then what kind of God is that? Is God choosing not to do that? Now, years ago, I had the right answer to that question. It was because it was all in God's will. And who are we to try and work out what God's will is? My auntie who died, people might say, oh, it was her time. It was God's will that happened. Now, I think this is terrible theology. And I think it's damaging theology. Because it is categorically not God's will that my cousin lives without a mother. And if it is, count me out, because I'm not following that God. There's a story about All Saints' Day in Lisbon in Portugal in 1755. As people sat in churches around the city to celebrate one of the holy days in the Catholic Church, an earthquake hit the city and 30,000 people died. The numbers were higher than otherwise they might have been because the churches were full, because it was this holy day. And there were two philosophers at the time, Alexander Pope and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And they were famous for developing a system of thought that was known as philosophical optimism. They attempted to reconcile a loving God with the fact that God didn't do anything to stop a disaster like the Lisbon earthquake. See, until then, the view around Europe and in philosophy had been that if you live a good life, God will look after you. And if you don't, you'll get what you deserve. But then the Lisbon earthquake came, and it turned all of that on its head. There was a French philosopher and poet called Voltaire who wrote a poem called Poem on the Lisbon Disaster. And he says this: all will be well one day, that is our hope. All is well today, that is the illusion. This poem changed the way that the church thought about God. He describes the earthquake and he asks the question whether that could have been in the will of God. And he says, why Lisbon? Is there more evil in Lisbon than there is in Paris or in London? Lisbon is destroyed while they dance in Paris, he wrote. And then he asks, who caused this evil? God, who is love. Can God possibly be the author of this? Lots of you will know that at this point, Christianity was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. And in the Bible, early Christianity in particularly, God looks a lot like Greek gods. Until Voltaire's poem, it was thought that God, like the Greek gods, was all powerful and would look after those who followed him. Turn up in church, you'll be okay. But then the Lisbon disaster happens, and it was those who turned up in church who weren't okay. And then as the poem progresses, Voltaire says, of course this isn't about God testing us, because God never claims to be in control. That's the Greek gods, like Zeus. He argued that this earthquake was proof that God is not in control. Voltaire said, it's you and me. We are. We have free will. We can do things that God wouldn't want. We have agency. I choose to cooperate with God or not. If I want to hurt someone today, now, I can, because God won't stop me. Voltaire's poem, I think, probably explains moral evil, what we do and why we do it. But the next question, often moving on from bad things happen to people because bad people do bad things, is what about natural evil, like the Lisbon earthquake? That didn't happen because a person has free will and chooses to do something bad. So what's all that about? Well, as I'm talking about prayer, I wonder if we look towards the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, the Lord's Prayer. There's a line in that where it says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are taught to pray for God's kingdom to come. We are taught to pray for God's will to be done on earth. Why would you pray that prayer if God's will is already done? Jesus didn't say, God, I know you're in control of everything and I know your will is being done on earth. Jesus calls us to pray that the world would become more like God's kingdom. We see examples of this in so many places in the Bible. Moses pleads with Pharaoh to let the people go, but Pharaoh doesn't. Throughout the Gospels, there are loads of people who don't follow Jesus. Later on, Paul gets shipwrecked, gets imprisoned, gets beaten up, loads of things. There are so many examples in the Bible and in our own lives where bad things happen and God doesn't intervene. But here's the thing, and this might sound a bit like a paradox, but I would argue this is because of love. Because we say we believe in a God of love, a God who is love. And the thing about that is that if God is love, God cannot be in control. Because true love does not control, it does not coerce. It doesn't force people to do its will. Any of you who have ever been involved in safeguarding will have heard this coercive control words or phrase applied to relationships. A healthy relationship is never a coercive one. A loving relationship is never one where someone has control over another. So if God is truly love, well, true love cannot coerce. It cannot control. True love is powerless. I'm going to move on now, but because I know we've mentioned this kind of thing a few times before, but if this is new to you, I really would encourage you to book in for the weekend that we were talking about earlier, because Tom Ord, who's coming to speak to us on that morning, he is one of the theologians that's really kind of shaped my thinking about some of this stuff, and we are asking him to speak on this topic of, if God isn't in control, then what's the point of prayer? So what does this mean for us then? Does it mean that there's no point in praying bold and impossible prayers? Does it mean there's no point in prayer at all? Well, you'd be glad to hear that I think that the answer is no. I mean, imagine if I'd said yes. I only finally got signed off as a Baptist minister last Saturday. Would have been the quickest turnaround since that guy who was the Green Party candidate for the Makerfield by-election for 9 hours earlier this week. But I do think it's no, and there are two quick reasons today why. Firstly, if you've been around this church for a while, you will know that people who stand up here will tell you there's a different way to look at prayer. Actually, you don't need to have been at this church that long at all to know that people who stand up here will tell you there's a different way to look at prayer. You could have come for last week for the same time, the first time where Michelle talked about exactly that. So I'm not going to go into this talk, into this idea too much, because if you weren't here, you really should just go back and listen to Michelle's talk. But she talked about this idea of conspiring prayer, a form of prayer where we create space to align our heart with God's heart. And as Michelle said, in doing so, we expand God's ability to answer prayer, because we can be the people who answer those prayers. We agree to become co-conspirators in the creating of a better world, or as somebody put it more succinctly than me, I asked God why there was so much suffering in the world, and God said, that's funny, I was going to ask you the same question. Or slightly more seriously, as a Catholic priest called Richard Rohr put it, if your prayer is not enticing you out of your comfort zones, if your Christ is not an occasional threat, you probably need to do some growing up and learning to love. We are co-conspirators in creating God's kingdom here on earth. Rebecca talked earlier about these roses that we're selling for, and the proceeds will go towards the violence reduction work that Oasis is doing around the country. And I heard a story coming out of one of those pieces of work that we were doing. It's a guy called Jamie who was stabbed on a night out. And when our youth work team got involved with him to follow up with him, because what we do is anybody who's been a victim of crime like this, any kind of aggression, any kind of dangerous crime, if they're taken to the accident and emergency department as a result of that, they get referred to one of our youth workers, and our youth workers do one-to-one mentoring with that person. There's a guy called Jamie who's been part of that project. He was stabbed on a night out. And when we got in touch with him, he said, you are literally the only person who has contacted me since this happened to me. You are literally the only person who has contacted me since this happened to me. I think that is our work in becoming a co-conspirator with God to bring more of God's kingdom to earth. Sometimes it looks like praying for somebody. Sometimes it looks like picking up the phone to a guy who has no contact with this church whatsoever and being the first person to contact them at a difficult time for them. Rather than coming to God with a shopping list, we create space to listen, space to be changed ourselves, to commit ourselves again to working to bring more of God's kingdom to these streets. I'm going to move on because I don't want to repeat all of last week's talk, but also because I think there's another important thing to say here. Because I wonder sometimes, I worry sometimes, that if our approach to these topics is a bit, if we do this, it can lead us to accept only the logical, the almost scientific responses to our questions about God. And I wonder that if in doing that, I wonder if we risk closing ourselves off to the unexpected. This is a quote from a book by an author and theologian called Diana Butler Bass. It's something that a friend once said to her. She said, why is it that the choice among churches seems to be the choice between intelligence on ice and ignorance on fire? I'm not totally happy with the word ignorance because I think it's probably unnecessarily derogatory, but you can understand the idea. This black and white, simplistic, in or out religion can often lead to this manifestation of Christianity which stirs the soul and makes you feel something like you're on fire. Diana Butler Bass's friend had got to the point where this simplistic approach to theology didn't work for her anymore. And she felt like she needed to find a church which thought more openly and wrestled more deeply with these kind of things, where questions were welcomed. But this intelligence, she said, manifested itself in something pretty kind of cerebral, where you walked out of church feeling like you'd learned something new, like your brain had been stretched, but she felt like she had lost a bit of the sense of wonder of who God was. Intelligence on ice or ignorance on fire. I think we need to avoid this, because I think honestly, after years of theological training and all of the rest of this stuff, I think that there is still mystery in this. There's still mystery in why and when prayers get answered or not. And I think the main difference between me now and me 30 years ago is that I've learned to embrace that mystery and be okay with it. I'll end with one more story. This is Pete Enns, who is one of my favorite theologians. He's a genius, like PhD from Harvard kind of level of genius. He's the kind of person who writes similar things about prayer to the things I've been saying this morning. But in one of the books that he's written, he talks about his daughter Liz, who was 16 at the time that he wrote this story. Liz had had a load of mental health issues for a few years and a few associated kind of conditions that went along with this. And after a long conversation, Pete and his wife and Liz decided that the best approach to her, the best treatment that she could get, was to move away from the family to a therapeutic boarding school in Arizona, which was 2,000 miles away from where they lived. It was a really difficult decision for the family to make. And at the same time that this happened, Pete's son was at college and he played college baseball. And the college baseball season apparently starts with spring training. They play a load of games in a short period of time. And they were going on tour for a week and playing 8 matches within this week. Pete's a big baseball fan, and the families had been invited to come along to spring training. And so he and a lot of the other parents had gone along as well. And as he was leaving, in the middle of this difficult period, he was talking to his daughter, and she said, "Dad, do you know what I really want? Do you know what I would really like is one of these bracelets. They were put out by Nike. It was after Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, had recovered from cancer. Nike produced these bracelets. They were sold really cheap across America, and all the proceeds was put back into cancer research." And she said, "Do you know what? I really want one of these bracelets. I think it'll be good for me to look at and kind of give me something to focus on as I'm going through all this stuff." And he said, "I'm going away for a week. There'll be plenty of downtime in plenty of different places. I will bring you back one of these bracelets." So he went off. And every town that they were in playing baseball, every place that he went, he would go to the local shopping mall. He would go around all of the shops, and he couldn't find them because they'd been sold out. And the day after, he would get up in a new town. He'd go to another shopping mall. He'd walk around again, and he still couldn't find any of these wristbands. And on the last day that he'd been there, he had no more time. He'd gone to all the shops in all of these towns. He couldn't get anywhere. And eventually he had to call his daughter and say, "I'm really sorry. You wouldn't believe the number of shops that I've tried, but they're totally sold out across the country." So he goes from there to a barbecue that's being put on. And he just gets chatting to the guy who's flipping the burgers. And as this guy John is flipping the burgers, he notices that this guy's got one of these Live Strong wristbands on. And he says, "Oh, you're wearing one of those wristbands?" And John's immediate reply was, "Yeah, do you want some? I've got a bag full." And Pete then said he hadn't even asked the question. He hadn't even done the social nicety of saying, "Oh yeah, I'm wearing it because this reason or whatever." He said, this guy had heard a question where all I had made was a statement. He said, after the barbecue, this guy came and found him. He took him into his house. There was a carrier bag full of these wristbands. So he said, "I didn't take one." He said, "I took 5 for me, my wife, and the 3 kids." And he said, "I wore it for years." He said, "I was still wearing it when my daughter came back from Arizona." He said 9 years later, I still can't shake that experience. And recalling it now brings back those emotions, and I feel that feeling again. I just can't shake the timing or the absurdity of that random exchange. I have chosen to trust God enough to accept that this was a God moment that will always remain outside of my ability to comprehend or analyze. I was a seminary professor with a seminary degree and a PhD in Old Testament, and it was time to learn to trust God. My wristband eventually got brittle and it broke in half, but I've kept it on a dish next to my desk. Writing this reminds me to tape it together, maybe look at it more often, because I need to keep my God moments before me. I was a seminary professor with a seminary degree and a PhD in Old Testament, and it was time to learn to trust God. I need to keep my God moments before me. And that is where I have landed on this as well. Because we can see prayer as a way of aligning ourselves to God's will. We can use it to drive us forward towards working for justice. And we can learn to be okay with a God who is not in control of every moment. But it's also okay to keep praying those bold and impossible prayers. Not with blind hope that God will definitely fix this problem and then feeling crushed when that doesn't happen, but as one part of this tapestry that is praying. So that is my encouragement to you, to me today. Let's commit ourselves again to both of those things. Let's commit ourselves to working for God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And let's also commit ourselves to praying those bold and impossible prayers, the ones that make us step forward into a faith which is beyond ourselves and instead is reliant on a God who still sometimes moves in mysterious ways.